Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to UConn Law School, and thank you to CATIC for co-hosting this exciting event. I'm Jessica Rubin. I'm the Associate Dean for Experiential Education here at UConn Law, and I look forward to our terrific program. We are sliding in right between two weather events, so I'm thrilled that the weather cooperated and our campus looks beautiful, and I really hope that you enjoy your time here. It's my pleasure to introduce to you UConn Law School's Dean, Ebony Nelson, whose visionary leadership empowers our students, inspires our faculty, and engages and serves our communities. And so, Dean Nelson, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Good morning, everyone. Oh, that was pretty good for our first round. Good job. Wonderful. Everyone's wide awake this bright and early morning. Well, again, my name is Ebony, and I have the honor and pleasure of serving as Dean of this wonderful law school. And so on behalf of the University of Connecticut School of Law, faculty, staff, students, and alumni, it is truly, indeed, my honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium co-hosted by the law school and CATIC on real estate law as a catalyst for closing the racial wealth gap. Central to our law school's mission is to engage in impactful research, education, and learning that we use to inform, serve, and benefit the community. Today's important topic provides a perfect opportunity for thought and conversation about the history and current state of racial discrimination in housing, real estate, zoning, and lending, and to discuss ways in which we together can create meaningful change. Given the racial wealth gap that has persisted in our country for centuries, and the integral role that laws and policies related to real estate and real property have played in that, I applaud and thank the organizers of today's symposium for providing us with this timely and important opportunity to explore these issues and strategies for actions and solutions. The organizers of today's symposium have assembled a stellar group of scholars, advocates, attorneys, and experts whose diverse perspectives will help us move towards a clearer understanding of how real estate law can bring about change and progress. I welcome and thank our moderators and panelists who have taken time out of their busy schedules to participate and share their expertise and insights with us today. I also thank Associate Dean for Experiential Education and Clinical Professor of Law, Jessica Rubin, and Stacy Sick for their hard work in organizing today's speakers and program. I also thank our events, ITS, communications, facilities, and catering teams for making today's event possible. And last, but definitely not least, I thank everyone at CATIC and the CATIC Foundation for the decades of support they have provided to UConn Law. Your generosity and assistance and partnership have helped to build upon the legacy of excellence for which we are all sincerely grateful. Thank you all for joining us today. I wish you a wonderful, successful symposium, and now it's my pleasure to turn the mic back over to Jessica. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Okay, so we're going to start the morning with our panel one, and I would ask our first three panelists to approach the stage. The title of this panel is Housing, Real Estate, and Lending Discrimination, and I'm going to provide a brief intro to each of our panelists and direct you for more information. You can scan the QR code at your table and get full bios of the speakers. So Professor Nadiyah Humber is an associate professor here at UConn Law School, where she teaches courses in property, race and the law, housing, and consumer protection. Attorney Michael Powers is underwriting counsel in the Massachusetts office of CATIC and a former adjunct instructor in history and political science at Worcester State University. Attorney Judith Rothschild is the director of licenses and inspections and the housing liaison for the city of Hartford, and a former state prosecutor. So again, I refer you to the QR code for more information about our speakers. And with that, I will ask Mike to start off our panel.
Hi, everybody. I'm really personally very happy to be here, and I'm very happy that my employer, CATIC Title Insurance, asked me to be here. And my job in my allotted 15 minutes is to take a look back at where we came from to get where we are today in terms of real estate law in this country. I have 15 minutes. This subject would lend itself to a one-semester, 3-credit course. There is no final, that's the good news, but if there was, everything would be on it. But I want to paint a picture for you. I teach CE classes for real estate, or for realtors, agents and brokers. And when I teach the fair housing class, I bring in my experience as a history teacher and also my legal history about real estate law, my familiarity. And I leave people shocked because a lot of this stuff is just widely unknown or misunderstood. So I want to jump right into it. I don't have a lot of time, obviously, but I want to start. I could go all the way back to, pre-Columbian America to start this thoroughly, but I want to start in 1932. We're in the worst year of the Great Depression in this country. Franklin Roosevelt campaigns. He doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't really know what the federal government should do to get us out of the worst depression we've had before or since. 25 or 30% unemployment with no social safety nets whatsoever. But what he promises is bold and persistent experimentation to get us out of the depression. He's sworn in 1933. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration is created, and that's the same good old FHA we know today. And its mission is to promote home ownership among working class Americans. But this is 1933, 34. Segregation is still a law of the land across the South. In the North, you have real stress and tension in cities that have been rapidly expanding due to European immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the Great Migration North beginning in 1910 of rural African Americans coming to the northern, Midwestern, and Western cities, Asian immigration. The demographics are exploding in the cities, and it's causing a lot of anxiety and tension in the cities. And one of the things that's going to be used is, of course, restrictive covenants, race-based, ethnically based, nationality-based. I see a lot of restrictive covenants. I see some that prohibit the sale or consumption of alcoholic beverages in some very old deeds. But, racially restrictive covenants, the oldest restrictive covenants I've ever seen personally are from Brookline, Massachusetts, 1855, restricting, sale or rental to people of color or people born in Ireland. And, the nuance there is a key to understanding what comes later, because the laws always default against people of color, and they can't get out of the hole that the society puts them in. If you're Irish, you may be discriminated against because you speak Gaelic and you wear a shawl, but your kids won't be. Your kids can integrate and they have that choice. But anyway, what's also created in addition to the FHA is the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Very similar to some, it's no longer with us, but it's very similar to some institutions we have today, quasi-government corporations that promote and make available and regulate consumer lending. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation's job is to help people refinance and stay in their homes. Very similar to what happened in 08, 09 after the financial collapse. People are losing their homes by the millions, and this entity was created during the Great Depression to help people do that. But now here's where it gets a little weird from a present perspective. One of the things they're going to do, the the Homeowners Loan Corporation, their appraisal department is going to come up with what we today call red line maps. And in the old days, they were called residential security maps. And I've brought a few of them with me today. I don't know that I'll have time to look at all of them, but here is, first up is good old Hartford, Connecticut. We are comfortably ensconced in the blue area, B3 this morning, but let me just jump ahead here. This is Worcester, Massachusetts, and this is actually an adaptation of the 1936 Worcester residential security map. I put this one on here because it shows you what the classifications are. Best, still desirable, definitely declining, hazardous. I like to say, leaving the morality and the justice issues aside, if you're an ambitious young business person and you look at this map, what the government map is telling you is don't do business in the bottom half of the city, essentially. It's bad business policy. It's bad public policy, even for its time. And I don't really have a good explanation for that. But I won't get into the minutia except to say that redlining, as it comes to be called, it's not that the maps are not a new revolutionary way of looking at things, but they're new in terms of federal housing policy, which is a new thing. And what's going to happen over time is that people of color are going to be steered into these hazardous neighborhoods if they're not already there. White people are going to be steered out of the neighborhoods. And what happens over the decades is that this is going to spiral down and become a bigger mess than I think even the worst racist might have anticipated in the 1930s. It's a domino effect or a cascading waterfall, if you want to call it that. But anyway, just a quick point of interest. I know of a religious restrictive covenant in the green fashionable west end of Worcester here, restricting sales to persons of the Catholic or Jewish faiths. An interesting point about the red district number 15, there were not a lot of people of color in there, but it was the lowest of the low, and that included my family, by the way. My French-Canadian great-grandmother went to work in the wire mills at age 11. She lived in 15. Her future daughter-in-law, Polish first generation, went to work in the wire mills. So that's just a little snapshot of what you get in the districts that become the places where nobody's going to lend and nobody's going to want to sell. And what happens with these maps, and this is, by the way, New Haven. I don't have time to go through it, and I don't really know the neighborhoods of New Haven as well as I do the other cities, but the shorthand version is Interstate 91 and Interstate 95 intersect where those four red areas make up the one area right in the center of the page there. So what happens, and what I'm trying to convey about the future damage that these maps and policies do, is nobody's planning for the interstate highway system when they draw these maps, but they're corralling people who are already at a disadvantage into bad areas that are run down. They're not going to lend to them. They're not, and if they do lend, they're going to appraise their house at a lower value. And then, of course, when it's time to develop an interstate highway system, and you're going to be taking by eminent domain and paying compensation, well, where do you go? You go to the cheapest neighborhoods. And that, in a nutshell, is the microcosm of the disaster of this policy. And I'll just show you a little bit in Hartford here. As I say, we are in B3 right in their center, but you see that there were people of color in both of these communities, the red lines down along the river. Now, what was characteristic of those communities? Well, they're close to the water and they're susceptible to flooding. So that even when these maps were being drawn, the Army Department of, the engineers, the Army Engineering Corps of Engineers, was already planning the levee system that was going to destroy some of these neighborhoods in part. And of course, if you know anything about Hartford, you know where Interstate 91 goes, right up through those red areas. People of color moved out further along Albany Avenue over time, and the people of color live further out along Albany Avenue on this map and further north, of course. But you have the levee system, you have the interstate highway system. In the 1960s, you have the quasi-well-intentioned but very poorly thought out urban renewal, which is, these neighborhoods are so blighted, let's just bulldoze them and put up something modern and sterile where people can't live. And that also affects these red line areas of Hartford. That's just another window on, and again, I only have 15 minutes, but it's the cascading effects of these policies that are really going to be bad. Here's good old Boston, Massachusetts. I will tell you that right now, if you care about affordable housing, Boston has had a problem for 40 years with gentrification that comes in two phases. The first phase is normal. The young kids out of college want to go to a cool city, so they go and make the neighborhoods unaffordable for the people who live there, who have grown up there, who reside there. But the second is global gentrification. There was a time just a few years ago when 1/3 of all the residential home sales in Boston were cash purchases. So this is foreign money coming in and snatching up housing. This has been an enormous problem in Boston and Massachusetts. So that's a different. We also had in Massachusetts big urban renewal in some of these areas. At the very top of the screen on the right, that's the north end, the west end of Boston. And that's an area that was completely demolished for, Mass General Hospital and some other things. But again, highly ill-advised in retrospect. Just as part of the problem, too, is when they demolished these neighborhoods, they put people into public housing, which ended up being much more poorly designed than they thought it would be. The nifty idea of only using a small piece of real estate to put a giant high-rise and cram a lot of low-income people into it ended up being another thing with cascading negative effects. So just watching my clock here. One last thing I want to say about these maps is you may wonder if a highway was put through that big giant area. Roxbury is right in the center of that area, that big red area in the middle. The answer is no, but it doesn't mean they didn't try. What they did was they planned to put Interstate 95 right through that area and connect it to the expressway in Boston. They took a lot of housing by eminent domain, they destroyed it, and then they changed their minds, and they put 95 up an existing state highway outside the city. So Roxbury is still there, very diverse, still many people of color who've been there for generations, a lot of new immigrants. As I said, 27% of the city is foreign-born. But these are all big challenges. But anyway, I want to get back to the discriminatory things. Under the system that these maps give us, the lenders are, the appraisers are going to appraise not based on the house, but based on the ethnicity, race, immigration status of the people who live in the neighborhood. And it's a destructive thing. Lenders aren't going to lend there. The associations of realtors are very active and vocal in telling their agents, don't sell there to anybody except the person of color. And so we get into the 1950s. I like to tell the story. The problems continue after the Second World War, even though they shouldn't. What should happen is veterans of color getting out of the service should be able to get their VA loan, but their ability to take VA loans is interfered with by the fact that they're bound by racially restrictive covenants in many areas. One of the people who's really irate about that is a guy I had the good fortune to meet years ago, former Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts. He was partly of African, European, and Cherokee Native American ancestry. He served honorably in World War II as an officer. He got the Bronze Star. He, like many veterans, he married a war bride from Italy and brought her back here. And at no time when he was in Italy was his racial background of any import to anybody. His wife's family loved him, his wife loved him, and they come back to the United States, and he can't live with her where he chooses because of racial restrictions that affect him. And that really galled him as a young man. He became a lawyer. He becomes a senator that drives the campaign for fair housing in the 1960s. Because what happens in the next few years, There's an important court case, Shelley versus Kramer. You can't enforce racial restrictions. The FHA says that that case will in no way affect the programs of the agency. The U.S. Savings and Loan Association's official policy in the 1950s and 60s is to refuse to lend to people of brown or black people, as they put it, outside of red line areas. African Americans who try to start their own lending institutions are prohibited from doing so or fought by the Federal Housing Administration. The National Association of Real Estate Brokers, we call it NAR now, pioneers in admitting women early on, white women. They will not admit people of color till 1961, and their local chapters are still opposing membership by people of color into the 1970s. So Edward Brooke is one of the drivers in the Senate. He's from Massachusetts. He's a Republican, but he's one of the drivers of the Kerner Commission that studies the riots of 1967 and concludes that we are dividing more into two Americas, one black and one white, distinctly unequal by 1967-68. That's part of what drives the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which includes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So I have 1 minute left. I've done pretty good so far. So what I'm trying to impress upon you is these policies, there were reasons why they thought back in the day, in the 1930s, that communities, you would hear this in the 1970s, that communities of people should live with people in common with them. And there are people a lot of people want to do that. But these policies that were sort of illustrated by this map, this is federal government policy that involves active intentional discrimination. And that's bad enough, but as I just wanted to impress upon you, it's the cascading effects that make it worse. You cram these people into designated areas where they can't get a loan to better the area, and then, of course, the areas get taken or are abused or neglected by public policy. So that's where we come to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It gets passed 7 days after Martin Luther King is assassinated, and his assassination is one of the critical things that swings the final votes. It's a really powerful story. But that is my 15 minutes, my friends, so thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Nadiyah, my Professor Humber, my colleague. Thanks.
All right, everyone. I'm so glad to be here and and be in conversation with you all. And so, okay, perfect. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really I'm going to pick up where Michael left off, talk to you a little bit about enacting the Fair Housing Act, do a brief Fair Housing Act overview, and talk a little bit about modern-day housing discrimination. What does that look like? And a little bit about enforcing the Fair Housing Act and testing. So the Fair Housing Act, right, and Michael just talked about this a little bit, but it was introduced into Congress 3 times, 66, 67, and 1968 before it was passed. And so again, right, the timing and the influence of political events were factors as to why it eventually passed. And Michael mentioned the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King was part of that reason. Some other tidbits as well before that, his assassination was JFK, right? He was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson took office during the LBJ administration. And just to give a little bit of context, right, regarding why there was a study of what was happening in the country at the time. So there were hundreds of race riots happening across the country, many having to do with individuals, communities of color, people of color being forced to live in concentrated poverty, structural oppression, police brutality, all of those sorts of reasons. 67 and 68 were particularly chaotic. And again, As you heard, in response to these many riots was an executive order in 1967 to study the underlying issues regarding these riots. And so out of that came the Kerner Commission report, which was published in February 29, 1968. And so the report, famous for its analysis, again, of this urban unrest, recommended and concluded that, famously, America was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And so the report recommended enacting a comprehensive federal Fair Housing Act or fair housing legislation. And at the time, again, the FHA was being debated in Congress. You had the assassination of Dr. King on April 4th, 1968. Just to give you a little bit of this timeline here so you can see that. It was Dr. King's last speech. His mountaintop speech was on April 3rd. In that speech, and usually when I present this to my students, I show them that speech. They hear what he refers to as, we will get to the mountaintop. I might not make it there with you, but we're going to get to the mountaintop. And so I think there was an understanding that perhaps he knew his life was in jeopardy, and then the very next day he was assassinated. And so, right, the country was in crisis, and so this pushed Congress to act as we just learned. And so it was passed on April 11th, 1968 by President Johnson, and we have the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Right around the same time, there was a Supreme Court case. I'm going to show you this housing slide. I know it's a little small for, the words are a little bit small, but Jones v. Mayer. This was a Supreme Court case that was published June 17, 1968. And so this case concerned a racial covenant, which at the time, right, in June, prior to the Fair Housing Act, racial covenants were still legal, as Michael mentioned, right? Post Shelley v. Kramer, it was only the enforcement of racial covenants that were unconstitutional, not the nature of racial covenants themselves. It wasn't until Jones v. Mayer that the Supreme Court ruled that racial covenants themselves were unconstitutional. Why is this important? The 1866 Civil Rights Act, the very first civil rights legislation or law in our country, which barred private discrimination in contracts and real estate transactions. It's codified today as Section 1981 and 1982. The 1866 Civil Rights Act was deemed a valid exercise of congressional power under the 13th Amendment as a badge and incident of slavery. So even though you have the Fair Housing Act that was passed, this comprehensive legislation was passed, the Jones decision was still important because it affirmed the validity of the 1866 Act, which provides authority over certain types of discrimination that the Fair Housing Act does not necessarily cover. So I'm not going to go into those details. But in any event, right, the case was a win for the civil rights at the time. So we have the original 1968 Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. And so in 1974, the act was amended to add sex discrimination. In 1988, the act was amended to add physical and mental, quote, handicap. That's the terminology that's used in the statute. It's a bit antiquated, but that's what is technically used. And they added familial status. So currently there are 7 protected categories under the federal legislation: race, color, religion. You can see here on the slide. As you probably know, right, the federal law is the floor, and states can provide more protections if they like. And so the state of Connecticut provides far more protections than what is provided under the federal Fair Housing Act. Section 3604 of the Act, this is what tells us, and again, it's a little bit small, but I'll just go through it very quickly, but this is what tells us the prohibited behavior, right? When we talk about housing discrimination today, again, what does this look like? So for example, refuse to rent or sell, make unavailable, right? You can't refuse to rent or sell a home based on a protected category, or make housing unavailable or deny housing based on a protected category. So if someone wants to view an advertised unit and the housing provider tells them that the unit is no longer available, when in fact the unit actually is available, perhaps they saw it still being advertised a week later, a few days later on the internet, that is arguably, right, both refusing to rent, sell, as well as making housing unavailable because of a protected category. Well, how do you know that they were told that the unit was unavailable because of a protected category? What if it was for some more benign reason, like they just didn't like your personality, or they didn't like your outfit that day, or whatever the case may be, right? How do you prove that? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. This is where testing evidence comes in. So I'll get there, but I just wanted to mention a couple more things, right? What else? What does discrimination look like today? So Michael talked to you about redlining in this country and steering and things like blockbusting. And so that behavior, those behaviors that Michael was mentioning, right, they're not explicitly prohibited in the Fair Housing Act. And so rather, that behavior, the redlining, the steering, and all of that, is encompassed within the language of otherwise make unavailable or deny. And so that's where that authority lives. There's ample case law that speaks to that. And so when we talk about racial steering, right, it could happen in different ways at different levels. It could happen on a macro level. It could happen on a micro level. And so by macro, I mean that people can be steered, right, from entire communities. So for example, agent could say, a real estate professional could say, well, if I were a single woman, I'd obviously want to rent in a safer area than this one, right? This is just an example. And that could be potentially gender steering. Or I think your mom would probably be more comfortable, I have these quotes in my notes, in an area where people speak Spanish. I can recommend some other apartment buildings that would be a great fit. Those things don't, if you are the housing seeker, don't necessarily sound so bad to be said to you. We call that discrimination with a smile in the testing world, and so actually that is a form of steering, right? You're not being shown units or communities where you want to be shown units or communities. You're being steered into other potential areas. There's also micro-steering, meaning that people can be steered to certain areas of specific areas, like a certain part of the complex or a certain floor, for example. Families with children, this is common. Another example of prohibited behavior, providing different terms or condition. Familial status, this could be potentially requiring a young family with children to pay a higher security deposit than perhaps a family without children. And so, right, all terms of rent, what have you, should be applied equally to all home seekers. An example of racial discrimination and different terms and conditions also could be regarding appraisers, right? When appraisers devalue home prices, perhaps because of race. I have just a few examples here of how we can see housing discrimination today in regards to technology, not necessarily appraisal situation, but I'll get to this in a moment. So here we have an example of a couple in New York. One was a professor, one was a doctor. They lived in an upper middle class neighborhood. They received a surprisingly low valuation for their home. How do we know that they received that low valuation, or at least how did they discover that? Well, they put a lot of work into their home. They were expecting a certain number. They got a number that was far lower, and they conducted their own informal discrimination test. So they whitewashed their home, meaning that they took all evidence down of any people of color living there, and they got their home appraised again, and they received a valuation of $300,000 more when they whitewashed their home. Another example of this, too, that I don't have here was a case, I believe it was Bailey v. Santander, where there was a mixed-race couple. Same thing happened. They reappraised their home, and there was a $400,000 plus difference in their valuation. And so you could see here in the chart, right, appraisal discrimination, it's being tracked more now by the National Fair Housing Association, more of a newer metric, but certainly an incident that's happening. Problematic, given that the CFPB's work right now is paused. We'll see what happens with some of these new standards that are supposed to be encouraged to the Appraisal Foundation, so we'll see what happens there. But some other quick examples, right? In sales, it's prohibited under both the Fair Housing Act and ECOA, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, to impose more stringent underwriting standards, making loan terms less favorable, right? You're probably familiar with all of this. But regarding these underwriting standards, speaking now to AI, right? So machine learning algorithms used by property technology, financial technology, fintech, proptech, these can exacerbate some of the discriminatory outcomes that we're seeing today in regards to loans, tenant screening, things like this. And this is because the technology, while itself is not discriminating, right, it operates using massive amounts of data embedded with bias. So essentially, again, tenant screens are one example. There was a pretty prominent case in Massachusetts, Lewis v. SafeRent, where Black and Hispanic plaintiffs alleged that SafeRent's tenant screening algorithm discriminated against housing voucher users, leading to denials of housing, despite the fact that the plaintiffs in those cases had impeccable rental payment history. So the court essentially ruled that that incident does apply to the Fair Housing Act, and the case was allowed to proceed. That case settled November 2024 for $2 million and includes protections for voucher holders and some reforms to screening practices and technologies. So last points I want to make, again, apologies for speaking fast. I just want to make sure I get through my 15 minutes. But how is it that fair housing laws are enforced? So we have the enforcement process. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to leave that to our next speaker. But generally, to enforce fair housing laws, right, individuals can file complaints with enforcement agencies, statewide, federal level, municipalities, what have you, and or file civil lawsuits in the regular court docket. Once you file, if there's a finding of probable cause, you can go from there and do adjudicative proceedings or file in court, have an attorney file on your behalf in court. So another way that I just wanted to explain, right, how fair housing laws are enforced is with discrimination testing. How many of you have heard of discrimination testing before? How many of you have not? Okay, so how about half and half? So I'll be brief, but what is this? So discrimination testing, it's an investigative tool that's used by enforcement agencies to help prove or expel the existence of housing discrimination. So you have paired testing, where you have two neutral witnesses, one control group, one protected category group. If we're testing for race, for example, the control group would be a white person, the protected category group would be a person of color, and you would have the same profile, identical profiles, except for the variable being tested, which is race. And then these testers go out into the field and observe everyday business practices of real estate professionals, landlords. They're not trying to entrap, they're not trying to have leading questions, they are just observing what happens, and then they report back. Some states allow it to be recorded, other states there has to be an immediate reporting written, like in Massachusetts due to the wiretap statute. So these observations, right, they produce evidence for claims of housing discrimination and can help decipher, say, if someone is discriminating. They can expel those allegations, or they can confirm or affirm those allegations. I wanted to show you a very quick 2-minute clip of a study in Long Island to show you what testing looks like. I will just play that. Is that okay? Okay. 2 minutes.
Yeah. So, 1, 2, 3. My name is Jesus Rivera. Today's the 21st of April.
It's about 10 after 2, and I'm in my car.
So it's Richard Helling testing as Matt Browning on May 3rd.
Hello. Hi. My name is Kelvin too. How you doing? Yes, Kelvin. Yeah, me and my wife is looking to purchase a home within the Brentwood area.
They were ordinary Long Islanders.
Great.
Maybe go get some water, okay?
And we sent them to meet with real estate agents to ask about buying their first home.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
All good?
Thank you. I'm David. Thank you.
They were trained, confident, and followed scripts.
Tag in Stephen Macropolis as Nicholas Parisi.
They had no idea what houses agents would suggest, or even which communities.
We're not going to like those schools.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want to do unless you don't want to start your car to buy your crap.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, okay, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, we shouldn't tell the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination.
I'm going to stop it there to transition, but as you could, this is an example of testing investigations. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to our next speaker, Judith, to talk more about enforcement.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to bring you into a different perspective, if I can, and that is to talk about the effect of bad housing or substandard housing and its correlation on discrimination in our communities. So my background, as mentioned, is as a state prosecuting attorney. My position was the chief prosecutor for housing matters for the chief state's attorney's office. Statewide, I handled prosecutions of the various health and safety codes, building, fire, zoning, housing, blight, and others. And it came to my attention early on in 1990, I did this for over 30 years, that there was a correlation, a very strong correlation between the bad housing that was coming in through the criminal courts for prosecutions of orders of municipal agencies and the conditions in the neighboring communities, and also the conditions of the health of the people living in that bad housing and around that bad housing, and also the criminal level of activity in the same neighborhoods. So I'm going to go over some of these points with you today in the 15 minutes that I have, now 14, maybe 10 seconds, and I'm going to try to point out some data which will show you that there is, in fact, a strong correlation in regards to these items. The first one I want to show you is the discriminatory effect that was found in research done in this particular case in the Detroit area. And you can read, I'm sure, that in the city, in the downtown areas of the city, there was a dilapidated housing problem. There's a picture depicting that as compared to in cities just not really far at all from the downtown area in a suburb called Grosse Pointe, a wealthy suburb. There was found to be nearly 12 years difference in life expectancy of the people living in those areas. 10% difference in teen pregnancy. And also, very importantly, there was also found as much as 20 years difference in some other neighborhoods of life expectancy. But most poignant, I think, is that Detroit's children suffered higher rates of infant mortality, asthma, and lead exposure in the areas that were downtrodden than in the areas that were well kept. So let's talk about those things. Asthma. So you probably know someone who's affected by asthma. If you don't, let me tell you that over 8% of Connecticut's children are affected by asthma, and over 10% of our adults are affected by asthma. And it is a debilitating disease. It is considered the #1 reason for people going into, pediatrics going into the emergency rooms for treatment. It is a very high cost to our state, and it regards the federal funding, state funding for Medicare and Medicaid for a great percentage of the money spent to treat this issue. It's the #1 reason children miss school. And if children miss school, of course, they miss lessons, they miss education, they get out of sync with their counterparts in the school, and some caregiver likely has to stay home with them as well, which is a loss of work. So asthma is something that is triggered by many things, but research shows that over 40% or nearly 40% of asthma attacks are triggered by something in the home. So what kinds of things? Well, dust mites, cockroaches, allergens, rodents, and mold. So I'm back to the conditions of housing for you. As a housing prosecutor, I saw many, many cases where houses had these issues, particularly pest infestations, also mold issues, particularly from lack of ventilation or from a bad roof or bad seals against the frame of the house that were causing moisture to infiltrate that would cause mold to grow. And these things were not taken care of, and these things caused reactions in the people living there. Asthma, similar to the lead poisoning issue, is one that the pediatricians that I've worked with over the years in various health and housing organizations trying to fight these types of issues would say routinely, we can treat a child who comes in for asthma. We can treat a child, although it be very difficult and painful at times to treat a child with lead poisoning. But if they're going to go home to a bad house, a substandard condition, we're not doing them the good that they need. So paying attention to the conditions in the home is necessary to do that. And interestingly enough, and you might have guessed this, our big cities in Connecticut are the ones that have the highest percentage of asthma conditions, asthma cases. And of the $86.1 million that we spend in Connecticut or is spent on asthma acute care, those cities account for only 18% of the population of Connecticut, but it also accounts for 45% of the funds that we spend on asthma care. So the cities have a focal point in these problems. They are a higher incidence of it. Now that I work for the city of Hartford, I don't work statewide. I work for a city which has got these problems, as do the other cities. But let me tell you, also from my statewide experience, every municipality has bad housing. Every single one has at least some areas which are not as well kept as others. Every single one faces these issues and needs to address them. So lead poisoning. I hope you know a lot about this, but let me just say quickly, children who are diagnosed with a level equal to or greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter are considered a lead-poisoned child. Blood lead levels as low as that have been shown to affect IQ, concentration, academic achievement. It is consistently diagnosed and consistently the most preventable childhood disease that we have. There is 0% lead that is acceptable or healthy for the body to take in, 0. So where are we finding this? The answer is still primarily the most common source of lead poisoning among young children is in paint, lead paint, which only became illegal for use in 1978. So in the old houses, it's likely there. It may not be the top coating of paint, but it's probably in a sublayer of it. So when it chips or flakes or becomes dusty, that lead comes to the surface and a child may have contact with it. There's other places lead exists, soil, water in cases, but Connecticut studies at this point, 90% of the children with high blood lead levels had been living in houses that had lead paint hazards. Only 67% had dust hazards, 36% were identified with soil hazards, and 0 were identified with drinking water hazards. So we're fortunate perhaps in that last way, but the housing needs to be maintained. It needs to be understood that when a child is entered into an environment with lead hazards, the child is at risk. An interesting study that I thought I'd bring to your attention, besides the issues relating to the health of people living in dilapidated housing, there's also an issue of whether these people are subject to a bad or worse outcome in life as a result of early lead poisoning. I certainly don't expect that you can see these charts, but what they say in some, these are charts, by the way, from various countries, the US, New Zealand, Britain, Australia, and Canada. they all indicate that as the predominance of lead in our society has grown and then lessened, so has the incidence of violent crime in the age of the adults who were poisoned at an early stage. So a childhood lead poisoning, when tracked in these studies, showed a correlation between children who were poisoned and later adult violent activity. So brain studies were done, prospective studies were done, population studies were done, but the hypothesis is pretty simple. Lead poisoning degrades the development of childhood brains in ways that increase aggression, reduce impulse control, and impair the executive functions that allow people to understand the consequences of their actions. Interesting study. If you would like a copy of it, let me know. I'm not sure that link is working presently, so I apologize for that. But if we could only solve some violent crimes by preventing them, by preventing lead poisoning, why wouldn't we do that? And my last study to point out to you is in regards to remediating abandoned or inner city buildings that look abandoned, that look dilapidated, and the effect on violence in the surrounding areas by doing so. So I think generally when I go down the street, I'm driving and I need to stop to make a phone call, because everybody should stop to make a phone call, right? Prosecutor talking. So I would suggest that I would not prefer to stop in front of the house that you see on the left. I would prefer to stop in front of the house on the right, because my senses would say it is likely a safer place to stop. And so it be. So this study done in Pennsylvania, actually Philadelphia, was done a while back now. It was tallied in 2010. Philadelphia adopted a doors and windows ordinance, and by doing so, they were asking property owners to make just the faces, the front of the building look as if it was an occupied, well-kept building. The insides could wait, but the front was required to do this. And then they compared the buildings that were made such and to the ones that were not, and they found that within just a half-mile area, even though only 29% of property owners complied with this ordinance in a 3-year period, that in a 12-month average, there was an estimated 19% reduction in assaults, an estimated 16% reduction in nuisance crimes, and a 39% reduction in gun assaults. Wow. So I work with police. Landlord-tenant criminal matters is something I still teach to police: lockouts, termination of services, tenant damage to landlord's property and such. I also work with all those code officials still, mostly now within just the city of Hartford, but even nationally, everybody has the same recognition of the correlation between bad housing, bad health outcomes, and sometimes criminal activity in those areas. So who's affected the most? The answer is people of color, Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, people who are living in these areas, perhaps because they were put there, perhaps because they couldn't afford elsewhere. But if we do not address the conditions of housing, their outcomes, their chance of putting themselves in a better position in life, of achieving what they are capable of achieving, what they're entitled to achieve, is greatly lessened. So my message to you is please, please think about this when you're dealing with properties. And if you or someone who you're representing or counseling is looking into buying properties or renting properties as a landlord or as an owner, have them consider the value of rehabilitating the properties, not just for their own liability, because of course they have liability also, but because the outcome for the people that they are going to be renting to or selling to is that connected to the best interests of that person, and as a result, to the community. I appreciate your attention on this, and I will be available if there's anything that I can give you to further explain these issues. I know there's colleagues here that I've worked with in the past that you'll be hearing from today that speak about the conditions and the programs that are available to resolve some of these problems. But I thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. So, thank you. We're now going to open it up to questions from anybody. Yeah, Zach. Do you want to wait one sec for a microphone?
Good morning. My question is for Judith. Two questions, actually. Who's typically responsible for property conditions, and what can real estate professionals do, attorneys, realtors, brokers, to reverse the discriminatory impact and the societal costs of substandard housing?
Well, thank you for the questions. Who is generally responsible for the conditions is the owner of the property. Let me also add that in many municipalities, LLCs, corporations, primarily LLCs are the owners of property these days. And they have management companies, especially out-of-state owners have management companies locally, so I hope, because there needs to be somebody who responds to emergencies and all the other things that happen in housing. But the owner remains the responsible party under Connecticut law, under state statutes, under the state codes and local ordinances. Primarily only the owner, so that is who is responsible, with an exception of if the issues are interior to the unit. In some cases, health and safety codes, state and local, do pertain to tenants as well. If they don't keep up the property, if they are damaging property, things like that, then orders can actually be issued to the tenant or to the owner and tenant where appropriate. And what can realtors, property, real estate attorneys and such do in regards to this problem? I think just what I ended with. Be aware of the effect of bad housing on the people that will be owning it or renting it or living near it, and encourage your clients to really look into the conditions of the house that they're buying or the building that they're buying. Public records exist, most likely, regarding what the city or town knows about those conditions, and have them pay attention to that before they buy. Because municipal officials have the right and obligation to inspect those properties and to order compliance. They may have already done that on a prior owner's case. And the new owner remains responsible once they take title to finish that out. So advise your clients and help them find ways to remediate them as quickly as possible.
Thank you. So just to follow up on that thought, when a city official issues some kind of compliance order with respect to a specific property, does that get recorded in the land records?
I'm sorry, I actually have hearing aids. Can you do it again?
Is it working?
Somebody up here.
Compliance order get.
So can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, can compliance orders be recorded on the land record?
Yes, are those orders, are they recorded as a matter of practice? Are those orders that are issued by a city official, do they get recorded in the land records?
We do record them in some cases. Not every municipality uses that practice, but they do in fact record them, for example, in Hartford. And it is something which we find is helpful to the city so that the new owner doesn't take blindly and say, I didn't know anything about it. There were some court cases back a while now, one in Westport where the owner of a property that had a health order against it being used as a full-time residence, it was a seasonal residence, sued for slander of title, and the court held that that was not slander of title, that was public notice, which was appropriate on the land records. There was a later case, commercial case, where a similar ruling was made, but we do advise municipalities to consult municipal counsel, and the method of putting it on and removing it has to be clear and followed.
Well, the removal part was then my follow-up question, which is if something is recorded in the land records and then the property owner and or tenant comply with it and remedy whatever that's been cited for, does the city then come back in and do sort of a release or a removal or a, sort of close it out, if you will, in the land records so that a title search would identify that, yeah, there was a problem, but now it's been taken care of?
So it should, I believe. I also see some cities and some city agencies do that with a follow-up posting into the land records that it's now complied with. Others have a notation on the initial posting that for further information regarding this order to consult the issuing entities. And that there you would find whether there's compliance or not. And I'll add, we get a lot of calls, can you take this off the property because we want to transfer and the title company with respect doesn't want to have that on the land records. It's our position, it doesn't stop a transfer, it's a notice facility. But it does sometimes, let's say, give it a hiccup, and we try to work that out.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oops, I didn't have it on.
Good morning. My question is from Mike with regards to FHA. So FHA started on a bad footing with blatant discrimination, and so that was quote-unquote corrected, and we get to today. The problem with today FHA is while it's no longer discriminatory on the face, it remains, if you offer to purchase a house with FHA, no one's going to accept it. So how do we fix those who are coming from behind who don't have a house to sell or an inheritance, don't have 20% to put down, have the grand FHA of 3.5%, but no one will take it. So you lose out on every house that is up for sale. How does FHA work to fix that? Additionally, FHA does not have a minimum credit score, but the bank who is offering FHA can decide whether or not they have a minimum score that they're going to use. So while FHA is there, I'm like, is it really there? Does it still have its lingering, a different kind of discrimination now? Like, how do we fix FHA?
How to fix FHA is above my pay grade. However, yes, there is still it is a different kind of discrimination. When you look at the early roots of the FHA, when they're actively advocating racially restrictive covenants, the backstory of that is that anything that was going to pass as legislation in Washington had to have support from Southern Democrats who were the people who instituted and supported and maintained segregation. But to your point, yeah, people of little means are at a disadvantage when they try to play the real estate game. And I know that I did real estate conveyancing for 25 years, and the problem that you would see is the sellers would say, oh, we're going to have an FHA appraisal, and they're going to make me reattach the railing going down the stairs, and they're going to make me paint. And so in terms of fixing that and making FHA loans more attractive to sellers for a prospective buyer, wow, that's really thought-provoking for me, because I recall a time when the housing shortage wasn't as critical, when an FHA buyer was considered as an attractive buyer, because sellers sometimes felt that if they were pre-qualified for an FHA loan, you did have this real serious headache of passing the appraisal with all the fussy requirements. But sellers did feel more assured that, that they had a pre-approval in hand that was going to be a solid pre-approval, just like a VA loan. So, I think your question may be related to the supply of housing. No, you don't think so? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
Okay, I have one final question for Professor Humber. You mentioned how property technology can negatively impact people of color and their communities. I wonder if you can talk about if it might have the opposite effect and be used to promote fair housing.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that in some way there's always going to be an issue with algorithmic bias in technology just because of the embedded bias, right? That is that the technology uses. But I think there are ways and efforts for companies that care to do so to try to minimize that bias. I think they have to be proactive, but right, there's ways to monitor the outcomes of the data, right? There's input and then there's output, and those output have real effects and impact on people's lives. And so I think there's ways to just see what that impact is and then recalibrate the AI models themselves or the data sets that are being used. And so that's one way, and there are companies out there and organizations and institutions that are doing that. And there's also prop tech out there that is trying to help with affordability and more access in the market. Things like, at least in the rental space, alternative screening technology where they could look more broadly at different sorts of credit history, not just the traditional mechanisms, but banking records. I think there might be a little bit of a privacy issue there, but and other ways too are alternative security deposit technologies that are used, sort of like an insurance model where you could pay a company and then they can pay if there are any issues with the home, and then you're sort of just paying a fee. There's rent rewards, right? There's different sort of innovative ideas in prop tech that are being used to try to create more access to be able to rent homes and the like. And certainly, like I said, monitoring of outcomes in mortgage lending and things like that. There are studies that show that sometimes the technology can be less biased than the humans, but not that there's also there are opposite studies that show the opposite effect as well. So I think it's just about monitoring, and there are some innovative ideas out there, but it's a new landscape. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to Mike, Judith, and Nadiyah. We're going to take a short break to change panels, and thank you all for a terrific panel.